Hello, I'm Eric Matisik, co-chair of Denver Startup Week. Last year, we were able to bring the global audience together for Denver Startup Week, and this year, we're excited to welcome that global audience back as we celebrate and showcase the best of entrepreneurship that the Denver ecosystem in Colorado has to offer. In Denver and beyond, there are lots to explore this week, but most importantly, we're excited that you're joining us. We have nearly 50 sponsor companies who contribute to make Denver Startup Week possible. Let's show our love for these companies today and all week long. Thanks to our headquarters and title sponsor, Amazon, and our title sponsors whose leadership makes this week come to life, Capital One Cafe, the Downtown Denver Partnership, Fluid Truck, Hotel Engine, and WeWork, and our track sponsors who've made all the great content you're hearing today possible, which includes our founder track sponsor, Kickstart, our growth track sponsor, Friday Health Plans, developer track sponsor, Quizlet, product track sponsor, Palantir, design track sponsor, Battery 621 and the Public Works, people track sponsor, Exactly, and the spotlight event sponsor, Strat Labs. Our headline event sponsors are bringing this excitement to the entire week. Thank you to B-Side Fund, Colorado Public Radio, Comcast, Coors Brewing Company, Denver Pavilions, Entrepreneurship at the University of Denver, Gusto, JP Morgan Chase, Method, Moss Adams, Pi Insurance, Promontory Mortgage Path, Red Bull Basement, Southwest, Tattered Cover, and the VF Venture Foundry. Finally, thank you to our sponsors and member sponsors who are listed on the screen, and thank you for your support of Denver Startup Week. Now, let's get to it.
Hey everyone, and welcome to Denver Startup Week. I am Michael Ostro, and I'm the Maker Track Chair, as well as a member of the Denver Startup Week Organizing Committee. Thank you so much for joining Denver Startup Week for our 10th anniversary. At Denver Startup Week, we strive to make all of our sessions a place where attendees can connect, learn, and grow, and that is regardless of age, gender identity, gender expression, race, ability, or sexual orientation. A special thank you goes out to our sponsors for their support and helping us make Denver Startup Week free for everyone and accessible to all. And I also want to thank Agora.io. They are the MakerTrack sponsor, so thank you, Agora, for making this happen. And thank you for joining us. Enjoy Denver Startup Week and make the most out of it.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you all for joining this session. My name is Tanya Ramon. I'm the product lead at Zeros, which is one of the companies represented here today. Before we get to panelist introductions, I also want to thank all the hardworking folks running Denver Startup Week and the Maker Track, like Michael, for putting together an impressive program as always. The event is a real feather in the cap for Colorado, and also thank you to the sponsors like Agora, the Maker Track sponsor, who keep this event free and accessible for everyone. That's pretty special. Okay, so the format is questions to the three panelists for about 45 minutes, and the remaining time at the end will be Q&A from the audience. If you have questions, please drop them in the chat because we are not using the Q&A function for this webinar. Okay, so let's get started. We have an all-star panel today, and so I'm going to go ahead and let each of you make your own introductions. We can start with, I'll just start on my screen going counterclockwise. Let's start with David Mittling, the CEO at Zayo.
Well, thank you, Tanya. It's a real pleasure to be here talking to the people of Denver and Colorado about what we're doing in the quantum startup space. So my name is David Mittling. I am the co-founder of Zayo. At Zayo, we are building a global timing service to replace timing from GPS, and it's enabled by the magic of quantum entanglement. A little bit about my background. I'm 2 decades in the traditional old space industry, working at major satellite manufacturers. These were big, exquisite satellites in the old space style, hundreds of millions of dollars, many years to build, get them on orbit. The new space revolution kind of intersected with the quantum revolution, about a decade ago. So I went and got my MBA and joined a startup based here in Denver called Bridgecom. In fact, that's where we got to know each other, Tanya. Bridgecom, I was an early employee in a startup that was commercializing optical communications, laser communications for satellites. At the time, that was kind of revolutionary for 2015, but since then it's been kind of standard for every satellite being launched today has optical communications. That's where I learned about quantum communications. That's where I learned about our technology, and that's I met my co-founders. We started our company in 2019, and it's been a wild ride ever since. So thank you.
And Zayo just completed the TechStars Starburst Accelerator program this year, correct?
That is correct. We were one of the 10 selectees for the Space Accelerator this year. It's been an outstanding program. Also, I would say a homeborn here in Colorado. So really outstanding program, and was a great opportunity for us. And prior to that, actually, right after we formed, we got accepted in the Catalyst Accelerator in Colorado Springs. So, when we get to that topic, I'll sing the praises of what Colorado is doing for the startup industry. It's really been outstanding.
Awesome. Great. Thank you, David. Dan, why don't you give yourself an intro and talk a little bit about ColdQuanta?
Absolutely. So Dan Caruso, I am a serial entrepreneur. I've been through three startups that all scaled up, all went public, and all exited for north of 10 billion. And they were all in the fiber optics networking business. In the 90s, the company that originally was named Chicago Fiber Optics and became MFS Communications was one of the first competitors of the Baby Bells, and then turned into an international company. We built fiber networks all over the US, Europe, and in many markets in Asia. We also bought UUNet, which was at the time the biggest by far internet backbone provider, carrying most of the AOL and MSN traffic of the early internet era. We then sold to WorldCom. At that point, a few of us got back together and wanted to do another startup. And that's what led to us moving out here to Colorado. Interestingly, we did a pretty widespread search of where should we go, because some of us were in Chicago and some were in Omaha, and we knew we need to be somewhere else to build that next company. And we looked East Coast, West Coast, and for reasons that are still true today, in fact, even more true today, we picked Colorado, and we formed a company that became Level3 Communications. So I was with Level3 Communications for a number of years, part of the senior executive team, and did one other stint before starting my own company. And that stint was taking private the distressed fiber company, ICG, that had that building that kind of hangs over I-25 in South Denver. It was in the latter portions of the distress stage of the dot-com, telecom, and we caught it at just the right time. We avoided bankruptcy, but we had to sell off the company. We did really well financially, but it was unfulfilling in that we broke apart a company instead of building a company. But that led to the building of what became Zayo Group. So we launched Zayo Group in 2007, went public in 2014, and sold in a transaction that closed last year for 14.3 billion. Along the way, I've done investing with the concentration of tech companies in the Front Range, but that's really my focus going forward now, is kind of direct investing in tech companies that are led by transformational leaders and who want to do something of significance. It's not startup, it's scale up. And with that, quantum's been an area of interest of mine for years. And I think quantum's beginning its transition from what was R&D to being a true commercial opportunity. And I've invested in my first couple quantum companies, one represented directly here on the panel with Corbin, and the other being ColdQuanta, which we'll talk more about later in the conversation.
Great, thank you. And then Corbin Tillman-Dick is the CEO of Maybell Quantum Industries, which is a semi-stealth company, but I'll let Corbin, you can go ahead and tell your story.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks so much for inviting me to the panel. As Tanya mentioned, I'm the founder and CEO of Maybell. Before Maybell, I studied mechanical engineering at the Air Force Academy and then economics at Johns Hopkins, and had a startup for a while after those, working on a novel form of internal combustion engine that I had invented. And realized as I was running that company that this bridge to a clean energy future that we thought this engine would be, because it was significantly more efficient than traditional engines, was getting short enough that you didn't need a better engine to get across it. So we sold off that IP, did fine, and I joined the Boston Consulting Group, where I've spent the last 10 years, made partner there, and had the opportunity to lead a bunch of our deep tech work and our quantum work. And working with these various quantum companies, it was interesting because I'd have conversations with the senior scientists at each, and I came to believe over the course of a couple years working with them that quantum is the most important technology being developed anywhere in the world today, that it has the potential to fundamentally change civilization and do it for the better. But I would talk to these senior scientists at each company, and each of them could explain to me why their qubits were the very best qubits. And we'll get into this a little bit more as we go through the conversation, but there are a whole bunch of different modalities through which you can create a quantum computer. And I realized really quickly that I wanted to be part of quantum, but that I had no way to evaluate which of these brilliant physicists with extraordinary pedigrees and Nobel Prizes to their names and other things like that, which of them was right about their qubits. But what I could see is that immediately on the tail end of that conversation about how their qubits were the best, they would talk about how their supply chain was a disaster. And that's what Maybell is designed around fixing, is we're looking at the enabling hardware for quantum, which spans a wide range of technologies, and identifying the ones with the most opportunity to be improved in terms of usability and improved in terms of a business, profitability for the business. And there are a wide range of places where we can play and where we can take things that for the last 30, 40 years have been designed and built by physicists for other physicists at low volumes for quantum as a research technology. And now as we begin that transition that Dan talked about towards quantum as a deployed commercial and industrial technology, these can be manufactured at scale and create a thriving company around it. So that's what Maybell's focus is the enabling hardware to make quantum possible. And thrilled to be part of this panel and have a chance to talk about why we're here in Colorado and what the future holds.
Excellent. Thank you so much for all your stories. Everyone really loves, it's inspirational to hear everyone's entrepreneurial journey. So let's get started with talking a little bit about quantum and this word. The word itself has, I believe, officially advanced to the status of a buzzword. We hear it all the time, but in this context, how would you talk about what qualifies as a quantum effect or a quantum technology?
So I'm happy to jump in on that. And if you look at it, classical computers, which have done an enormous amount to create the world that all of us live in, fundamentally, all of them, from a wristwatch to a cell phone to the most powerful supercomputers in the world, they have the same architecture, right? And it's an architecture based around stable binary states, something being on or off. Now, quantum is where things get weird. It's where things that all of us take for granted in the classical world that we live in fall apart. Things like the speed of light and causality And these, governing principles of classical mechanics break down, and we switch to quantum mechanics. And that allows us to do fundamentally different things with information, how we control it and how we use it. And while there are a range of quantum technologies, quantum sensing, quantum imaging, quantum computing, which I think is the one that takes up a lot of air, but is candidly a little bit farther out than some of the sensing and imaging technologies, and quantum networking. All of those, to be really quantum, they have to rely on these special quantum states: entanglement, superposition, interference. If you're doing that, you're quantum. If you're not, in my opinion, you're branding something as quantum without really being quantum. Dan, David, I don't know if you have a different opinion there.
Yeah, I mean, if you're not getting into the realm of qubits, which is where the transition from bits, which as Corbin talked about, bits is what we think about when we think about the digital age. It's a 1 or 0, and every advancement in computing and communications to date has been how fast can you process and move 1s and 0s. But when you get to the qubits, this isn't just a way of doing that faster, it's doing it in a way that's just fundamentally different. It's how you control these qubits that have properties that we don't see or sense in the world that we live in, the classical world we live in. They have kind of connections to one another that's called entanglement, that was first interestingly discovered by Albert Einstein, but when he discovered it through math, he concluded it couldn't possibly be real. He called it spooky action at a distance because he was poking fun at it. How can two things be connected in real time, separated in distance, but have kind of what at the time he perceived to be a cause effect with one another? And it really wasn't a cause effect, but it was when something happens to one of them, instantaneously, no matter how far apart, with exact precision what happened to the other one, because they are entangled. And that's just the way things work, even if it doesn't make sense in the world that we live in. And then there are other properties as well, the superposition, the tunneling. So when we learned as humankind how to engineer to the level where we can control qubits and control superposition and tunneling and entanglement, we're going to be able to do things that are way beyond what we could even imagine today. And we know it will happen because that's really how the world works.
When you think about those classical systems, the binary state, the on or off, the 1 or the 0, that's part of it. The other thing, and this is going specifically to computing, but it has implications for the other areas of quantum sciences, is your processor in a classical computer looks at each bit one at a time. Now, it does it really quickly. It doesn't feel like it's one at a time. It's trillions or even quadrillions of times a second, but each bit is a discrete event in your computer's processor. Your quantum systems, not only do you have these qubits that aren't a 1 or a 0, but they're a quantum superposition of states. For me, the helpful way to think about it is as a probability that it will resolve to a 1 or a 0, but your qubits are resolved as a single entity through entanglement, right? And that means that when you add 1 qubit, you're not increasing your computing power by 1 qubit, you're increasing it exponentially at 2 to the n qubits. So there are certain types of problems that, we're all familiar with things in materials science, things in medicine getting discovered accidentally. And the reason we discover stuff accidentally in those spaces is we're really bad at understanding molecules. And we're bad at understanding molecules because they are almost incomprehensibly complex. Penicillin isn't a particularly complicated molecule, it's 41 atoms. But if you were to try to just write down all of the data associated with what makes penicillin penicillin, and you're trying to store that in a classical computer, you need a classical computer with more transistors, more of those charged wires, than there are atoms in the observable universe. A quantum computer that is mature and fully interconnected can do that with 286 qubits. Now, right now, there aren't 286 qubits that are high quality and interconnected anywhere in the world, but we're seeing really steady progress towards that by a wide range of players, including ColdQuanta, including Intel, including IBM, including Google, including Honeywell. There is a steady march towards increase in the number of qubits, the quality of the qubits, the interconnectivity of the qubits. And in not too long, we will see problems that are not just hard for classical computers to solve, but fundamentally impossible for classical computers to solve. We'll see those start to get solved in ways that really change all of our lives over the next however many years in the coming years.
And I guess I would tack on to what Corbin's saying too, because that's a very good point, right? Quantum has become a buzzword because the major corporations have used it to brand things that have nothing quantum in them, right? But the focus should be on, look, quantum is you're harnessing the magic of quantum, the power of these quantum properties of small particles to do practical things. It's application focused. So, Corbin talks about that, like what quantum computers can do. I think that's a bit more important and germane to what we're trying to accomplish rather than, getting into the weeds of quantum, because quantum has just been, as a word, has been just, it's kind of lost some meaning to the layperson who doesn't understand, hey, there's actually fundamentally major quantum processes we're harnessing for important applications.
Yeah, I mean, would you say it's fair to say that, the quantum regime is one where you're harnessing properties that are at that length scale of the atom or the photon, and that you just can't observe at the macro scale, and being able to be sensitive enough to the universe at that scale to be able to harness those properties?
Yeah, and you can even have single atom controls and processes that aren't quantum. It's when you're both handling that and engaging entanglement, superposition, quantum tunneling in a deliberate way to drive intentional outcome. And that's where you really transition from talking about quantum to using quantum.
Yeah, temperature is a real important property when you think of quantum. And if you think about what is temperature, what is heat, it's motion. The hotter something is, the faster it's bouncing around, and the colder something it is, the less motion it has. And when you get to a point where you basically suck out all of the energy out of, say, an atom, it starts to get so cold that it changes from being governed by classical properties, the world we're familiar with today, to becoming part of the quantum world. It actually transitions its state from what is we think of as liquid and gas and solid as the states of matter. Well, there's more states to that, and the fifth state is called the Bose-Einstein condensate, and that's what happens when a particle, an atom in this case, gets so cold, so motionless, it begins to transition to a state where its quantum properties take over, and it behaves just differently than it would have behaved had it been hotter. But it's got to get real, real cold, like pretty close to absolute zero.
Yep. All right, excellent. Thank you. So, and let's talk, we've talked a lot about quantum computing, and I think Corbin mentioned a little bit about how, quantum computing gets a lot of the press these days, but that's not all of the quantum technologies, and there's other categories of quantum technologies. Would someone like to talk about the distinction and examples of non-quantum computing technologies?
I can take that one. So yeah, you're right, Tanya. So people think of quantum, they naturally leap to the conclusion that it's quantum computing because that's gotten a lot of development effort, definitely a lot of investment, and definitely it offers some really impressive applications that we can all understand. But there's three legs to what we call this umbrella of quantum technologies. Quantum computing, which my colleagues will talk about in much more detail than I could. And quantum sensing, Dan mentioned that a little bit about, Bose-Einstein condensate and how you're using that to do some pretty incredible things with atomic clocks and other kind of very, very impressive sensors. And then the realm that we play in, which is quantum communications. And just from a high level for people in the audience, the fundamental difference with quantum communications is it deals with entangled photons. So quantum sensing and quantum computing, you're kind of working with particles that are entangled and, for information processing and things like that for these very interesting applications. But, scientists, about 30 years ago, figured out a way to create entangled photons. In fact, photons, particles of light, were what really inspired the original ideas of quantum mechanics over 100 years ago. And there are things you can do to manipulate photons and create pairs of photons that are entangled. So my colleague likes to call them, everything else is qubits. My colleague likes to call it flying qubits, because they're photons, they move at the speed of light. And so then they're used for completely different applications than quantum computing or quantum sensing. So those are the major umbrellas that all quantum technologies fall under today.
Yeah, so when I was referring earlier to atoms getting very cold, that they basically become motionless and then they change states. Well, when they get to that level, they become very, very sensitive to their environment, extraordinarily sensitive to their environment. And it's by taking advantage of their sensitive environment that you could create devices, systems out of that. And there's different categories of what you would be trying to solve for. One is motion. How fast is something moving? What direction is it moving? How quickly is it rotating? So think gyroscope, think accelerator, but think about something that can keep such accurate track of itself that it doesn't need to be tying into satellites in order to stay synchronized. There's a word expression called dead reckoning. They can be extraordinarily accurate at dead reckoning, knowing kind of the path that you traveled with extraordinary precision. That's going to be really valuable in the world we're going to live in. It's going to be really valuable for autonomous vehicles and certainly for defense applications and a whole bunch of other things. The other thing that these very cold atoms are really good at is telling time. They become extraordinarily accurate clocks when they get to that level, more accurate or as accurate as clocks that are the most accurate clocks, in humankind today, but it can be built into devices that are far smaller and far less expensive. But another example of this, and one that I think is going to be gigantic, is you could also design them in a way that they're real sensitive to radio frequency signals. They become extraordinarily accurate receivers of radio signals across very wide spectrums. So very small devices that you could hold in the palm of your hand that are more sensitive than a tower full of receivers, and they can look across a significant portion of that receiver band, including bands that today's mobile networks can't touch because of the limitations of conventional receivers. So that in of itself could be a gigantic revolution.
Yeah, and picking up kind of the quantum computing side of things, there are, as I mentioned earlier, a whole bunch of problems that classical computers just can't solve, that once they're beyond kind of very rudimentary challenges with molecular modeling, binary and trinary molecules. Once you're beyond that, you need a quantum system to solve it. But it's not just that, which in and of itself would usher in a world of personalized medicine and no future pandemics, because at the same time you identify the coronavirus, you're able to develop in silico a perfect therapeutic or perfect vaccine that has no side effects and only interfaces with that one virus. So I mean, that would be pretty extraordinary. But it's also things like lithium air batteries. It's things like zero net energy carbon fixations. It's things like low greenhouse gas fertilizers. So that's the molecular side of things. Then, as an engineer, and I think a lot of us on the phone are engineers, people often don't realize how quickly you run out of computing power if you're trying to analyze a structure or analyze turbulent flow or analyze an aerofoil. And it's because those systems are interconnected and complex, and classical computers are bad at that. But quantum computers should be extraordinary at that. And so we'll see cheaper and stronger and lighter aircraft and rockets. We'll see a whole new type of engineering through quantum-aided engineering with new materials and new structure designs. And then, eventually, you have the decryption and code breaking side of things that tend to get a lot of press. They're a little bit scary. The good news for all of us is you'll be able to, end disease before you'll be able to factor Shor's algorithm with a quantum computer. And so we'll have a pretty clear idea when that's coming and be able to update to kind of quantum resistant encryption protocols. But there are a whole bunch of problems that quantum computers solve that will be pretty extraordinary.
Wonderful, great, thank you. So let's talk a little bit about markets and market maturity. A lot of the quantum technologies, especially the hardware, could be arguably more in the R&D stage, just maybe at the brink of commercialization, and maybe more in the market formation stage. But not all quantum technologies are there. Can you talk about the different maturity levels for different quantum technologies? And then for the ones that are maybe not as mature, what is the business case now for funding these outside of a research institution, for example? What are some creative ways to subsidize this important work?
Yeah, so maybe I'll jump in with the first part of it and kind of where are we at with the commercialization of quantum? I think we often use the baseball analogy and say, are we in the first inning? Are we in the preseason? Well, I think in this case, we're kind of like when baseball was being invented back in the late 1800s or maybe early 1900s. Quantum is going to be a long, steady road. But I'd liken it to where the internet was in the very early 1990s. If we were sitting here having this conversation in the early 1990s and using expressions like TCP/IP and even the word the internet itself, most people wouldn't know what you're talking about. Like, what's an internet? What's it going to do? I never heard that term before. But then you get to 95, so just a handful of short years later, and internet was a buzzword. People knew the word and they had some sense of what it was. But if you tried to have a conversation about, well, is the internet a communications thing? Is it a computing thing? Is it an application thing? You've gotten some pretty strange answers based on the lens that we could look back at it today. We wouldn't have described, yeah, the internet's going to make this thing called Uber, where you pull up this thing called an iPhone and you touch a couple buttons and a car shows up at your house and it knows where to take you and automatically pays. You'd be like, what are you even talking about? You're dreaming. So it took a while to get there, but not that long of a while in all the scheme of things. The world changed dramatically since the early 90s. There's one kind of quick story that happened this week. There was a big federal government powwow about quantum and involved big companies like the Googles, IBMs, and Microsofts, as well as upstarts like IonQ and ColdQuanta and others. And I wasn't there, but people were relaying it to me, and they said the really big companies like Google were like, oh, this is years away. It's 10, 20 years, maybe 30 years. It's really not going to have much impact anytime in the near term. And the smaller companies who are very well funded, they're like, I don't know what they're talking about. This is happening right now. We're doing this, we're doing this, we're doing this. And what I thought of is the early 1990s. If you talk to the original AT&T, not the current form of AT&T, or what was Verizon back then, and they were called something different, I forget what. And you say, well, what about this thing called the internet? How's it going to transform your industry? Like, what are you talking about? That's a little toy, and I don't even, it's maybe have a little effect, and no, it's not that big a deal. And if it is, it's going to be 30 years away. Well, those companies got totally disintermediated by them not knowing how to embrace that when the right time was there to embrace it. And I'm hoping quantum picks up a ton of traction over the next 3, 4, 5 years. But frankly, it's not 100% clear if that's what's going to happen in the short term. Some people think it's going to take longer. Some people think it's happening right now.
Yeah, and I think that there are, across those players, the Googles, IBMs, and the small players, there's an acceptance that quantum computing is going to be as important to the next 30 years as the internet was to the last 30 and the integrated circuit was to the last 60. I mean, this is a fundamental and profound technology revolution. The question of, is it 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, or 20 years? There are brilliant scientists who know their own systems, their own qubits better than anyone else in the world, who are making bets at different numbers along that. Part of the logic of Maybell was to say, we know quantum's coming, and we can build a company that is focused again on delivering the enabling technology for that, so that it doesn't matter that much to Maybell, whether it's 5 years or 20 years, we can be an extraordinarily successful company throughout the growth of quantum. And that's what motivated our focus on kind of the picks and shovels. If you think back to the gold rush, it wasn't a prospector who made the most money there. It was Levi Strauss selling jeans. It was general store owners selling equipment, and that's what Maybell is doing for quantum.
Well, one thing we do know as a fact is lots of money is being raised in quantum right now. Hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars are being raised and invested in quantum. So is it early if you want to make money in quantum? Not if you're designing business plans around those hundreds of millions and billions of dollars that are going to be spent in the next handful of years.
Yeah, I think it's I read over $1 billion so far in 2021 of VC investment.
Yeah, and I guess I'll chime in from the quantum communications arena, because to use Dan's analogy, this is 8th inning, 9th inning there. And we're leveraging technology that is a little bit more advanced because it's been demonstrated since the 70s. The first entangled photons were demonstrated by experimentalists and research scientists. The initial application actually for quantum communications was a protocol called quantum key distribution, or quantum cryptography, where you're sending, I would send you, Tanya, one of my entangled photons. I would measure the other one. And because they're entangled, that magic, we would both have the same information. So we would create a string of random bits that we would use to encrypt communication between the two of us. And that was invented in the 80s, 90s. Experimentalists built them, numerous research labs developed it. Companies formed around this, startups formed around this a decade or so ago. And now in the last 2 years, 3 of them have gone to very spectacular exits. QKD is one application for it. There are companies churning out boxes. You can go online right now. You could buy a box from Cubitek, from Toshiba, from ID Quantique, Thor Labs. Go to Thor Labs. It's a catalog item, an entangled photon source for I think $20,000. You could buy it and play around with it, and starting getting clicks across your lab with these single photon detectors. So definitely, and I'll comment one more thing on that too, which is, for all of us, it feels like we're in the 8th inning. Boxes are being built, quantum networks are being deployed around the world. But China's not even in the 9th inning. China they're in the middle of the second game of the doubleheader. So I do want to emphasize that, at least in the quantum communications realm, China invested in it a lot early on, and they're kind of reaping the grain from that investment, made a decade ago that everybody else kind of ignored.
It might be in a doubleheader, but it's a doubleheader in the early 1900s. We are just scratching the surface.
I agree. I would agree with that statement. Yes.
But hey, that's when you want to be involved. You don't want to be involved when the party's almost over. You want to be there, just as people start to show up, especially when it's going to be a big, exciting party.
So let me bring the conversation back to our state of Colorado. And let's talk a little bit about why Colorado is really an epicenter for quantum technology in the world. What advantages does Colorado offer for a startup building their business around quantum related technologies?
Yeah, so Colorado is one of the small handful of hotspots in the US. It's not necessarily the leading hotspot, but it's certainly in the safely in the top 5. And the reason for that is Boulder in particular has been active in quantum and an innovator in quantum for multiple decades through the work being done both at NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, as well as CU Boulder. CU Boulder and the combination of those labs also produce an extraordinary amount of quantum talent, quantum technical talent. It's one of the biggest hubs of where that type of talent is coming from. The aerospace industry also contributes to this being a hotspot for quantum. And then the fact that we're a great startup and scale-up community adds to that on top of it. So you see more quantum activity, more federal money that flows into quantum, a lot that's related to CU and to the labs, but also there's people who then come out of those environments, like for example, at ColdQuanta, who know how to then win research dollars, and the scientists that once were in NIST and CU Boulder now become part of the commercial world, but they're still operating off of government research grants that further the commercialization of the technology. So the thing we've got to be cognizant of in Colorado is we're in a good spot as we sit here today, but that can get away from us just because we're well positioned early on. There are other geographies that are putting far more organized money behind being a premier quantum hub than Colorado is, and we need to operate with some kind of fear and uncertainty and doubt, and make sure that we have a much more cohesive effort, starting with the state level, city level, when it comes to Denver, and and a collaborative effort between the for-profit and not-for-profit ecosystems. Chicago is a great example for how much you could accomplish if you really get all of those constituents working together.
Yeah, I agree with every word that Dan just said. Colorado has every reason to lead this race. There's a critical mass of talent here. There's a critical mass of enthusiasm for people to move here. It's easy to attract talent to Denver if they're not already in Colorado, attached to NIST or CU or one of the other quantum leaders in this space. But there's also a challenge we have around retaining that as companies scale up, right? It's very easy when my priority is providing a handful of PhDs with a life that they really like to say Colorado's the right place to do this. But there are a lot of states that, Maybell is in a different position than a lot of quantum companies, because we're going to need a lot of kind of traditionally blue collar workers to build the hardware that we are making, right? And as I look at going from a team of 20 to a team of 100, with the balance shifting from scientists, engineers, PhDs to machinists, welders, technicians, there are a lot of states that are offering an awful lot of incentives to build that factory somewhere else. And so trying to strike that balance and invest in the future in Colorado by saying that, we see what quantum is going to do and we want to be part of that, it could be an absolutely transformative investment for the state. There isn't a Silicon Valley of quantum computing yet. And there's no reason that Silicon Valley would be in Silicon Valley, because the skills you need, the people you need, they're just different. But it's going to be somewhere or a couple places. And, I think Chicago and Illinois and, a handful of other places are putting their money where their mouth is in a pretty impressive way. And Colorado, for all of its fantastic advantages, there's nowhere I'd rather live, could do more to prioritize quantum.
Yeah, and to kind of tack onto that point, if I think the state of Colorado, if they really look at this as being advantageous for the state, for the residents of Denver, for this area, it's got to have some investment. They have to have some proactive efforts to attract companies and startups to the Denver area, because it is a quantum arms race. You're really seeing that, particularly in the last year, that perception that there is no established quantum Silicon Valley today. The other major quantum computing companies are scattered a bit. There are kind of natural hubs around research labs like NIST, like the University of Colorado, but they tend to be Argonne in Chicago and Oak Ridge on the East Coast, and labs on the West Coast. So, and they're putting money into it. They're very serious about creating an ecosystem where quantum scientists can go, have facilities, have some, to be kind of blunt about it, some incentives to set up shop here. Otherwise, 20 years from now, we're going to look at, hey, the It's not going to be the quantum front range. It'll be, quantum valley here, or, quantum something there. So.
Yeah, and Dave, you had made a point about analogy to, say, the aerospace economy in Colorado, and how you want to talk about that?
Yeah, no, I was going to use that example when, when we formed BridgeCom in 2015, the core team of us were in Silicon Valley. And we looked around for, we knew we had to get out of Silicon Valley. That was, we came to that consensus early on. It's just too expensive, just not the right place to recruit or retain talent, just because of the expense and cost of living. Everybody says Silicon Valley is great. I'll argue that, because it's, unless you're building a software company. And we got some incentives from OEDIT, from the Office of Economic Development here in the state of Colorado, to move that startup, a space-based startup, to downtown Denver. And that was what put me over the edge when I convinced my board to make the move, because they wanted to move it to Washington, D.C. So these efforts help. They provide that incentive for these kind of nascent startups to move here and create that ecosystem. And I think right now, I could be wrong, but I think the aerospace corridor, here in the Front Range, it's, depending on how you're doing the metrics, is number 2 compared to Silicon Valley or the West Coast. So it's really an outstanding aerospace community here. And that could be the same path that quantum follows, with a little bit of proactive effort.
And so what are some other means that state or even local municipalities can offer to spur this along, to further entrench quantum in our state? I mean, tax credits are the obvious incentive, but what are some others that that might be worth discussing?
Well, this isn't really government incentives per se, but in Chicago, they set up a Chicago Quantum Exchange. And that's a collaboration between multiple universities, as well as research labs and some for-profit organizations. The state put money in, and they also were able to track significant federal grants. So now they have a significant physical space where a lot of quantum activity is taking place. You're able to equip it with a lot of quantum fundamental equipment that is needed to develop quantum applications. You have a congregation of a lot of quantum talent. And then one of the other things they're doing on top of that in the Chicago Quantum Exchange is an accelerator that they've called Duality. So Duality is a business accelerator, all centered on quantum. So I think Colorado has an opportunity to be a fast follower and set up a similar institute. And there's activity underway within CU Boulder and NIST to try to get traction on that. I'll be spending more time with them over the next month or two in order to help push that effort forward. But I think we need something like that, because then it's easier for the government to grant more money, federal government to grant more money into the state, because they see kind of a lot of activity around this being a quantum leadership hub.
Yeah, and I'll agree with that statement there, because we got accepted into a Catalyst Accelerator, the Colorado Springs, Catalyst campus there, really outstanding program. And the programs that Dan's mentioning, you have that in Chicago, but we're also now part of the CDL Toronto Quantum Stream. There are similar kind of things that are being set up in Maryland, in New York, and other places like that. So I feel like that's a great starting point, is having that, I don't want to use, kind of hammer on the word ecosystem, because that seems kind of buzzy, but this is how you get those young companies together. They start working together, they collaborate, and that's the seed that grows the fertile garden that will be here in a decade.
I think that is right. I think there's also more beyond that. When we're talking to some states out in the Rust Belt, and I realize their kind of employment position is quite different than what we have, but there are programs out there where for every welder we hire, they're going to pay half of the salary for the first 3 years, right? That's a pretty extraordinary program for a company like mine that's looking at scaling up to hundreds of employees building hardware, right? And it's not only out in the East and the Rust Belt. Arizona's incentives from a state level, they're a lot richer than Colorado's incentives. Now, Colorado has a counterweight of being the best place to live and having this critical mass of talent, right? And it's a tension that as a leadership team, we're dealing with really actively, because we need to attract and retain the most brilliant scientists out there. And that's easier to do here than in certain places that have richer incentives. But it would be a whole lot easier to make that decision on building our big factory here if the incentives were more in line with some of the leaders. And we're pretty far back in terms of cash incentives for companies scaling up. We're leaning heavily into the fact that everyone wants to live here, and accepting that companies are going to make that choice, and we're here, so it's not necessarily the wrong choice, but it does make it a much harder choice than if we were at least kind of middle of the pack.
And let me just interrupt real quick here. Please feel free to enter any questions into the chat. And then, we'll keep talking if there are no questions, but please feel free. No question is too basic. We'd love to hear your questions.
Yeah, I was going to say, while we're waiting for questions to come in there, Tanya, I agree completely with what Corbin's saying, because being able to attract quality talent here, we've been kind of surveying or talking to quantum scientists and quantum optics people in major research labs around the country. And they all say, yeah, they would love to move here. It's a good quality of life. That's attractive. I can tell you Silicon Valley and other places in California, they will not move there. It's too expensive. The quality of life is too low. So I do feel there is that natural gravitational pull, but you do have to have, I guess, I really think that proactive effort is really valuable for making this making this the core part of what Denver and Colorado is.
Yep.
Okay, we do have one question. So Frank is asking, how can someone get started in quantum technology coming from a traditional tech background?
So Frank, shoot me an email, because Maybell and every other company in this space has to do traditional programming in order to interface with quantum systems. And we're hiring. I know that others on the phone are hiring as well. And it's not something where you need to come in with a deep understanding either of quantum physics or of Qiskit or the other quantum languages out there. Those are useful if you're trying to build applications, but if you're building the fundamental hardware, again, most of the people who I hire are going to be welders and technicians, right? And then I'm going to have a handful of folks who are programming controls and user interfaces that have to interface with classical computing systems, and that I want to be robust and industrial strength and outstanding world-leading human-centered design systems, right? And the number of folks who actually have to do the quantum physics, yeah, it's going to grow over time, but the best way to learn it is by working at a company like Zyros, like Maybell, like ColdQuanta, where you're getting exposed to it every single day, and you'll pick up on it over time as it becomes more part of your job. I don't know, David, Dan, if you disagree.
I just want to maybe amplify what was said there is the kind of skill sets that are needed in quantum range the full gamut to literally to, as Corey said, machinists who are welding devices together and building literally physical devices, to traditional mechanical or electrical engineering, design folks, software side. And yeah, you need quantum experts, but 80% of the jobs or more are not going to require experience or degrees in quantum technology. You're going to need that, but that's going to be a small portion, not most of the jobs.
Yeah, no, I agreed, both doubly, because, again, I'll go back to the baseball analogy. Everybody thinks they're quantum. It's just too high tech to break into and get into. But the reality is, the quantum scientists, the quantum researchers, that's the pitcher on the team. You need all the other positions filled. So I know on our side, we're looking to hire a wide range of engineers and software talent. So yeah, that's the other comment you made there, Corbin. Just dive in. If it's of interest, hard target those kind of companies, and you're never gonna. I don't know if you're ever going to be a quantum scientist. That's going to take a bit of work, but you will be able to talk at least intelligently enough at cocktail parties to impress your friends.
And that's the important thing. So we have a question from Joshua, who asks, when do you anticipate quantum startups to be profitable on their own by selling quantum systems or products?
It depends on the startup a lot. Maybell's path to profitability is a lot shorter than a lot of companies because we're selling, again, the picks and shovels, right? For folks building qubits, it's going to be a longer road to profitability, but it's really hard to say right now unless you are one of those tiny handful of scientists at the very core of this, how long it is before we see general applicability of quantum technologies to day-to-day business problems. The fastest companies in the next couple of years will start to be quite profitable. Others, it's going to be 5 or 10 years would be my guess.
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, on kind of our side of the spectrum, we got a analysis that shows, hey, we'll be profitable in a few years, but it depends on how aggressive you want to scale and expand. So if you really want to just kind of swim in your lane, so to speak, at least on the quantum communication side of things, the path to profitability is relatively quick, but the size and your ability to grow will be constrained a bit. So we kind of looked at a couple different, I think there's been 3 exits on the quantum communication side of things. They're all making revenue. They're all selling boxes. They're all installing systems. I don't know if any of them are profitable. I doubt it. But again, they're a bit more focused on deploying, with the idea that profitability at bigger numbers will come later.
Yeah, the goals of most quantum companies in the next 10 years are not going to be to show profit. Yep. It's going to be to carve out a really interesting position for themselves. But as an investor of Maybell Quantum Technologies, I'm thinking March, maybe April of next year.
The gauntlet's down.
Slackers. Okay, so we have time for maybe one more question. This one's from Jonathan. He's asking, what's a good place to find news on the quantum industry?
I don't know if others have additional sources. I find both quantumcomputingreport.com and the Quantum Daily pretty good. And then I have a Google alert that plops stuff that's specifically interesting to me. But both of those are decent sources.
Yeah, the Quantum Daily does a really good job of capturing a lot of the news and organizing it and making it interesting to read. Google News Alerts is almost every other day something interesting pops up.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I was going to say, those are 2 great sources. The QEDC, Quantum Economic Development Consortium website, is starting to have good information. Inside Quantum Technologies, which is a trade organization, has a daily newsletter. And if anybody's interested in quantum communication specifically, not the quantum computing and quantum sensing you guys have, but we're putting out a weekly newsletter where we aggregate the interesting news in the world of entangled photons. So you guys can hit me up. Our email's on our website. I'll include you in our distribution.
Okay, and one more quick question from Dennis. He wants to know, are there any marketing or sales efforts needed at this time?
Yes, absolutely. Yep. Yeah, there's no question. If you'd asked that question 2 years ago, that would have been a different conversation, but that's part of the early transition from R&D to commercialization. Is it's time to build those customer relationships. I mean, there's real products, real services that are emerging, and you need to reach your customer base.
Yeah. Well said.
ColdQuanta at the end of last year had 0 salespeople, and maybe 1 or 2 people would describe themselves as marketing. Now it's probably got 10 in those categories, and it really needs to have 20 before too long.
All right, well, we are at time now, so I think we can wrap this up, but I do want to say an enormous thank you to our 3 panelists who have just given us some great insights and information about this world of quantum. And I also want to thank all of our attendees, both in the Zoom chat and on the live stream as well. Thank you for your time and attention. So have a great day.
And Tanya, thanks for doing this. Appreciate it.
You're
Yeah.
welcome.
Mike.
Of course.